Well, good evening. My name is Adam, and I will be um, leading a new session at Elios School of Ministry on apologetics. And my goal for these sessions is to encourage you that everyone can. We are called. We are called to give a defense for the faith, for the hope that lies within us through the gospel, and to defend the faith. However, when it comes to defending the faith, it can be very challenging. It could be difficult. It could seem quite complicated. So my goal is to try to, at the best I can, to challenge you, but then also to maybe simplify the approach a bit more and to use a particular methodology that can um, that can be most practical in everyday situations, which is why I chose this particular approach, cultural apologetics, where we haven't where because people are engaged in culture every day of their life. Everyone has a particular culture in which they are evangelizing to, and their work colleagues engage with, and within that is trying to understand each person, who they are and how they see themselves in the world that they live in, and from there they end up building a culture around that narrative in which they've created. So, and for the Christian, is trying to understand, okay, well, if someone is living a particular narrative that they've constructed by their imagination, how do we bring the gospel narrative in order to say why actually what the gospel presents is actually more coherent to how things are, how our understanding of humanity, but then how our understanding of the world, but then how God interacts in time and our understanding of God comes together. And it is through that through the gospel, not only is it true, but also the narrative that it brings actually brings a coherent vision for reality, and that it actually defeats all the other cultural narratives that we see um, in our world today or in our society. So the topics that we'll be covering over the next few weeks will be, how do we understand the culture we live? So how do we begin to think critically about the narratives that have been presented to us? And also this involves questions about the self as well, because because culture is shaped um, by ideas, and ideas are spread through music, art, education, social media nowadays, and we have to be discerning about what is the prevailing narrative that is meant to that people today adopt in order to try to explain the world in which they live in. And I think it's important for us Christians to know that. But then once we have an understanding of that, we need to think of these worldviews in light of its truth, in light of the good life that it's meant to present, and also how do they understand the beautiful? And that would be the next 3 weeks. So we're going to look at them individually as far as what is truth, what is the good life consist of, and what do we what do we mean when we call something beautiful? And you recognize that these are like traditionally known as the three transcendentals: truth, goodness, and beauty, and how the gospel, in one sense, presents a coherent vision for all three of them together. And so we're going to look at week one: how do we understand the culture and the self we live in? And if for this, the outline for today's session is we're going to look at in three parts. We're going to look at the modern dilemma of understanding the self, some of the problems that may arise when people speak about identity in today. God, as Christians, we know that our identity and who we are is a big part of our understanding of the world around us and how we engage with the world. But then that is also true in the modern world as well. Like, questions about the self are really important, and how one views oneself is going to have an impact on how they see reality, and also how they're going to hear the gospel message in relation to who they believe they think they are in that moment. So questions of the self are really important. So that'll be part one. Part two is the importance of like narratives as a means of understanding oneself in the world, the role of imagination. So we're going to look at how culture is sometimes shaped um, by sometimes storytelling, and then using the role of imagination to present people a vision of a particular possibility of the way the world could be. Now it's asking, is their imagination of a particular of how the world could be a godly vision, or is it a secular vision, or is it a biblical vision, or is it a non-biblical vision? And that becomes really important in how people see themselves in the world through stories and through their imagination. And then the third part is looking at how modern narratives about reality still follow a religious narrative structure to explain their own story. So we're going to be looking at, when we look at the biblical narrative, we see a biblical structure of the creation. We see the fall. We see the fall of man in sin, and then we see Christ redeeming humanity from sin by believing in Jesus, and then we see the consummation where God restores the world, restores a new world, a new heaven, and a new earth in that. But then once we see is that in the world, and the other modern narratives that we see still follow in some sense that same structure, and we're going to be looking into that more in detail later. So, part one, the modern dilemma of understanding the self. So with the Enlightenment, there is an emphasis more on reason and what reason can know. So even though Descartes was René Descartes, the philosopher, who said the famous statement, "I think, therefore I am." Even though he was a Catholic, and he had a intention to try to prove the existence of God, but his methodology for truth placed a greater emphasis on reason than say on external authority like scripture, for instance, and tradition. So, for instance, when he says his famous statement, "I think, therefore I am," what he's trying to accomplish is he wants to know, how do I know something is true? How do I have guaranteed knowledge that I know what I know is true? And in order to do that, I need to build it on a foundation that is that cannot be doubted. And from that foundation, you end up building a worldview from these basic truths that cannot be doubted, and then you end up building a structure and a worldview that are based on these indubitable truths. So, for instance, and for a belief to be indubitable, he believed that it needed to be self-evident. It needed to be incorrigible beliefs, so beliefs about mental states, and also sense perception. So he says, in order for something to be true without evidence, you needed those three components. However, the problem with that is some people argue back and say, well, belief in God is not necessarily self-evident in the same sense that 1 and 1 equals 2. So there are people who don't believe in God. So is God self-evident in the same way 1 and 1 equals 2? Some people say, well, no. Is God part of one's mental state? Well, in one sense, that they would say, like, it doesn't necessarily deal with like sensations of pleasure and pain, so God doesn't really fit into that category. And then also, God is beyond sense perception as well. So, like, it's not as if one sees God in the same way I see the laptop in front of me. So, if that becomes the criteria of what it means to be rational, then beliefs in God slowly start declining within that structure. Now, I would talk about more on that next week when we look at truth, but I just wanted to give a brief overview of why certain beliefs in God, when you emphasize the role of reason and bringing everything down to the boundaries of mere reason, ends up becoming problems about the nature of who God is and also biblical revelation. But with the modern dilemma and the decline in beliefs in God, you end up creating a dilemma, and the dilemma I think that ends up coming up is the link between authenticity and rationality. So how does so when we and how does because at the end of the day, what I guess what a human being and what a human being or a human society would need is we need to be rational in our perception of the world, but then we also want to believe that each individual is also authentic in their own right, and that so they want to be authentic in their judgment about the world as well, and that when they assert a truth, they're not asserting it in a way that is just like a chemical process in their mind. There was a sense of deliberation in their own conscience to assert a particular truth, that, and in that sense they were authentic, and that it just wasn't a byproduct of some sort of chemical combustion in their brain, that they were deliberate in their conscience and in their will to come to that judgment. So with the enlightenment and with the problems, what ends up happening is that how do we have a philosophy that harmonizes these two things together? How do we say that someone is authentic in their conscience and their will, but then also is also rational as well, that they appeal to the facts of the created order? So to be authentic is to submit everything to the bar of their own judgment. So a mature human being would ask themselves, okay, well, that they have a freedom of the will in their conscience, that when they ask themselves that something is true, that they are doing it not because of, like I said before, because of some chemical combustion in their brain, but actually that they themselves chose to submit a particular truth to the bar of their own judgment, because from their judgment they have a conscience, and that conscience is catered towards truth and not falsehood. So you have that. But then also they want to be also the demand for rationality as well. So we recognize as human beings that we need to also conform our judgments about the world to the external world around us. And so what ends up happening is that so what you want is that in order to be rational, that you want to recognize that our human bodies are not just an isolated individual that has their own judgments. Actually, we need to make sure that all our judgments as well, even though we want to be authentic in our judgments, but we also want to be rational in the sense that we want our judgments to also reflect the creative order that everyone else is also seeing as well in the process. And what ends up happening is that without a link between these two, you end up having different types of movements that spread from it that either emphasizes one or the other. So with an atheistic Darwinian perspective, they would emphasize rationality. We are going to suggest that Darwinism, in one sense, an atheistic Darwinism, puts people in a category of, say, a more of an animalistic traits, where you start looking at where you can just, to know a human being is just to know how they reproduce and survive within a particular environment. And within that, you end up devaluing a sense of value for the particular individual and their own ability to come to a certain particular judgment about the world. But actually, whereas their judgments is just a byproduct of their nature around them, and not something that they themselves chose, but is more that nature entrusted a decision upon them. So you have that rationalistic perspective. But then you got the authentic perspective, where people are so driven towards a sense of self-identity and authenticity that, if we look at today with the transgender movement and the gender fluidity, that people say that they would say that they would believe that, well, actually, even though science may say that there are two genders, well, for me, I'm going to say I am not going to conform to that particular form of categories. I'm going to invent another category, and from that, people end up elevating authenticity over rationality. They end up, and the desire to want to be your own person, to be your own, to make your own decisions, to be able to say that my life is my own type of authenticity. That when I made decisions, I didn't make it in light of external biological forces that are in the world. Actually, I made that choice deliberately on my own. And I think either way, with the decline of belief in God, I believe that you end up having these two kind of strands of thought end up dividing, and they lead to consequences in how culture is manifested over time. Now, when we look at, well, what do I think as far as like how people would reconcile this problem of authenticity and rationality? Well, I do think that the image of God does provide at least a kind of balance between being authentic but then also being rational. So with the image of God, we are made like God, as we see in Genesis 1, like creating His image. We're made like God. Thus, we have like a freedom of will, because when God created, He created with a particular freedom in one sense. So in one sense, we mirror God's actions in the sense that, and also worship as well requires an act of the will. Like we need to worship something, like we're created to worship, and we either worship God or we worship a created thing in the world, idolatry or something. So we're like God in the sense that we have the freedom of the will, but then we recognize that with the image, we're also governed by God. And we see that when Jesus says to the Pharisees, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things are God's. So when Jesus is presented with a coin, the Pharisees came up to Jesus and said, should we pay taxes to Caesar? And Jesus says, show me a coin. And he says, okay, well, and he says, whose inscription and face is on the coin? They said Caesar. So they said, which means that Caesar, the fact that one of the most precious things in that society at that time would have been, and even today as well, the value we place on money and possessions is massive. And we see that Caesar has his face on that coins, which shows his dominion and governorship over that land, because his face is on the money and the currency of the coins, of the money. And but I think Jesus in this point actually says, okay, well, we recognize this coin has Caesar's image, and we know that Caesar has dominion, but you are created in the image of God. So what are the things that belong to God? Well, where is God's image in the world today? So Caesar shows his governmentship, putting his face on the coin, but where does God place his image in the world today? And he places his image on humanity, which means that he also shows a sense of that God is also governed and is above humanity, and that we ought to give back to God. The same way that Caesar's money, that way that Caesar's face has, his face is on the coin. Therefore, you need to give back to Caesar what is Caesar. But then now, because we're created in the image of God, we need to give back the things that are God's. And so in one sense, I think the image of God is to show that we're like God, but then we're also governed by God. And then therefore we're like God, that we're free to will, but the fact that we're governed, and therefore we're under the authority in which God has created. Therefore you build the rationale, and that truth, goodness, and beauty is rationally consistent with God's nature, and so on. So you end up, I think, being authentic in the sense that we are created in His image, and therefore we have value as human beings, each individually, and God recognizes us. But then we also recognize that rationality is also governed by God's nature, because in Himself He is all true, He is all good, He is all beautiful, and He structured the world in a particular way that conforms us to recognize that we are authentic, but then also the rational order is also that also creation has also a rational order to it, because He's designed it in a particular way. So I think this kind of balance between authenticity and rationality is converged sometimes within the biblical text of the image of God. But with, again, like I said before, with the decline in the beliefs of God and the decline that actually we are created in His image and we have a special place in the world, what we end up seeing is that people's understanding of themselves ends up diminishing over time. Ends up diminishing culturally, and we see that kind of understanding of the self diminish. Are we purely animalistic in the sense of that we're just created for survival and reproduction, or do we have to reinvent ourselves every time? Because as soon as someone puts a particular identity on us, then we need to overcome that identity in order to be authentic and to be completely individualistic and so on. So you create this dilemma within the modern world between authenticity and rationality. And there's actually a song I really enjoyed. It's by Fleet Foxes and Helplessness Blues. A beautiful song, and they're a non-Christian band, but I think it's the lyrics, I think, kind of help us understand this tension between these two perspectives. And the song starts off like this: I was raised up believing that I was somehow unique, like a snowflake, distinct among snowflakes, unique in each way that you see. So we see at the beginning of the song where the lyricist says, well, where he was raised, he was raised within a particular environment that said, you are completely authentic, you are, that you have, that you're not like any other human being that there is, that you are completely authentic in your approach and your life, and you need to walk in that. But then he kind of changes his mind, and you see in the second half of this verse, he says, now after some thinking, I'll say I'd rather be a functioning cog in some great machinery, serving something beyond me. Now what we see here is actually, well, he's left behind what his parents or whoever his guardian was growing up told him, and said, you know what, actually a more fulfilling life is to be part of be part of the creation whole, and to have at least a place in this world system. That whatever that looks like, I don't know, but I would rather be serving in some place in this world. And even though it's this, and when you think of like a functioning cog, there's no difference between one functioning cog and another functioning cog or other machinery. Like everyone just kind of knows their place, and then they're just working within that. And so he doesn't want to be truly authentic. He just wants to find a place in the world. But then when you asked him, which I think in one sense is not necessarily a bad thing in one sense, because obviously we see as Christians, the world is, as we see later on, like created, and that every Christian within God's kingdom has a place in the world, and no places and we have to recognize our role, and that we are serving something beyond me. And sometimes people, they were in this song, and the writers searching for that longing to have a place in the world, but without a Christian worldview, this is the conclusion he comes to. But I don't know what that would be. And then he says to the listener or to whoever he's speaking to, he says, but I'll come back to you someday, soon you will see. So he doesn't like the fact of being truly authentic. He wants to be serving having a place in the world, like a functioning cog in one sense, just something where he gives him some sort of sense of purpose, serving something beyond him. But unfortunately, with the most dilemma sometimes with a lot of people, that they don't know what that would be. And I love the last line in the song where he says, someday I'll be like the man on the screen. And so at the end of the song, he, when it still feels like, because in movies, it feels like all the characters just know their place in the world, and everything has a happy ending. This writer is kind of desiring, maybe I'll be like the man on the screen. But at the end of the day, it's but I'm bringing this up because I see this challenge between, okay, well, I want to be, is it possible for one to be authentic, to be distinct among snowflakes, and then also be like a functioning cog? It's functioning cog that is not distinct from other functioning cogs who are exactly the same as other functioning cogs, but you're serving someone beyond me. And I guess there's this tension again between authenticity and rationality. Like, where does one's purpose truly lie? And I think in the biblical perspective, it lies in a reconciliation of both and recognizing the two. But these questions about how do we understand ourselves and our purpose, our meaning, comes to an understanding of the self and identity. So when we speak about the self or identity, what do we mean? Well, one, it's a sense of one's own individuality, an awareness that I am, like, for example, an awareness that I'm not my dad. Like, people have this awareness. I think the song that we just read, the lyrics, I think there was an awareness that he was, even though it's a critique of individualism, in the sense that being completely individualistic, but I think he also recognizes that, because with a functioning cog, like, a functioning cog isn't aware that functioning cog is different from another functioning cog. But as human beings, we recognize that we are different from one another. So I think an understanding of the self does have to come with a sense of an awareness that I am me and I am not you, and vice versa. Another understanding of self and identity, it comes an understanding of my purpose in life. So, what is the final goal of my life? Why am I born in this particular time and place and not another particular time and place? And what is my purpose in life? So what do I consider the good life to be? So when I speak about being virtuous in my society or doing good deeds, like, what do I consider that to be? And how do I obtain, I would say, even a larger question about the self. What does it mean to be happy? Like, what does the good life consist of? What does it mean to be happy? And this is obviously related to the other song that we just read. Like, it's, what does it mean to live a life that is happy? So when it says that, what do I consider the good life to be? What does it mean to be happy? And how do I understand myself in relation to those around me? So when I'm confronted with, when I'm confronted with someone who has a different perspective of me, or has a different perspective of the world, how do I understand myself in relation to that person? Because we're going to come across it where we see people who have different perspectives on the world, and when we encounter them, we end up gaining more knowledge about ourselves, what we are not, in relation to who they are. So those are kind of like four categories of what I mean by like self and identity. Now, what is a modern conception of the world? How is the self understood in the modern world? Well, with this, we see an inward focus on the psychological life. That's one thing. So what we mean by that is like desires and emotions. So traditionally speaking, within the church, we would come to an understanding of the self by looking outwards. So we would say, well, I know who I am because we're created in the image of God. And by creating in His image, we are created to worship. Therefore, I find my identity in worship. Therefore, I find my identity in looking outwards, not by looking inwards. But in the modern world, we have it kind of the other way around, where I look at my desires and emotions, and I ask myself, okay, well, based on the desires and emotions, how do I understand myself? And this is why when you emphasize desires as being one of the key indicators of understanding who you are, and this is a big part, the greatest desire is going to triumph over other desires, which is why sexual identity becomes a big part of our culture, because one of the biggest desires and drives and emotions in a person's life is sex. And we see that in the culture at large, in the music and so on and so forth. Like, this sense of attributing identity and sex together and sexuality together are a big part of one's view of themselves and their view of an identity. And we need to understand why conversations about sexuality become a big part of our culture, because there's such an inward focus on trying to understand the self. A second part of the modern understanding of the self is an understanding that life is in a constant state of development. That that because there is no fixed point of there's like a fixed point of um, because with the belief of God, you would have a point of reference that God does not change. So truth does not change, goodness does not change, beauty does not change, and that God, because God never changes, therefore all the attributes of God and who God claims Himself to be in Scripture, doesn't change. Like it, no matter how much the seasons may change. However, with the decline in the belief in God, what ends up happening is that there is nothing really to root the world in something that doesn't change. So therefore, everything is in a constant change and development. And we end up seeing this in the modern mindset of the self, where actually, where what ends up happening is um, people's understanding of truth ends up becoming a constant state of change. We end up seeing gender as being more fluid and not static. We end up seeing identities and how people see oneself, because desires and emotions change all the time. Therefore, one's view of oneself ends up changing over time. So there's not, whereas before you would say the image of God, regardless of how you're created, regardless of what happens in your life, you're still created in His image. That is no longer a possibility in the modern self. So you have this kind of constant change of development over time, and which ends up building sometimes a generational snobbery, as C.S. Lewis would put it. That 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 there's a sense of progression that people believe, and therefore it creates much more of an optimism that they believe that as society is moving forward and developing, it's getting better. But as we see biblically, I think it's going in the opposite direction. But and number three, as far as the modern understanding of self, is that nature itself provides a moral source within us. So instead of looking to, say, an external authority, say like scripture, divine revelation, or viewing nature within divine revelation, like say, like in natural theology, we're going to look strictly at nature, and nature should provide us with the tools in order to see how to live morally within and how to find also one's purpose within. So you end up focusing on nature, which is, yeah. So we end up building a life through inward focus on desires and emotions, recognizing that your life is in a constant state of development, so it's okay to change over time, and then also that what you need to be one with nature in one sense, as one with your body or one with the external world, in order to come to an understanding of who you are and use that as a framework for morality. So with the focus of the interior aspect, our culture is looking for a narrative story that can make sense with this type of self. So how does one see their life as, with this understanding of the self, people end up constructing a story about themselves that reflects this kind of inward focus of, and this, and over time, this story is in a constant state of development and change over time. And this becomes problematic for people actually coming to know who they are, because if who they are today may not be who they will be tomorrow, and that can create a lot of anxiety for a lot of people. So beliefs about ourselves are shaped by our attempt to want to be authentic and rational. If you lean on authenticity, this leads to a denial of rationality. If you lead to a strict form of authenticity, this leads to a denial of rationality, as we talked about before, where we look at the scientific community. If the scientific community says, no, there are only two genders, and someone comes along, well, actually, no, I believe that there are 50 genders or so on, now you have a tension between two sides, who you can have a secular atheist, brilliant scientist, and someone else who also doesn't believe in God, but believes in the sense of being authentic to their true self in one sense. They can clash heads, and because of these issues, because one is emphasizing one, the other one's emphasizing another. So, and the other side, if you lean too much about rationality, about authenticity, this leads to a devaluing of human beings. So when we see in, like, say, more of a Darwinian kind of, an atheistic kind of Darwinian perspective, where people are just, you can kind of degrade someone's mind, conscience, and will to more animalistic tendencies, and that you can just explain all behavior through survival of the fittest and reproduction, and that this is just what drives the mind and human beings, and that this brings to a devaluing of, I think, human beings in general. Um, yeah, and how you end up building a coherent society within that framework is also leads to a lack of, I think, justice for human beings, and um, a lack of a moral compass to actually understand that maybe when an act is done unjustly, that this isn't just a product of one's social environment, but actually that they deliberately chose to do evil in one sense. And that so I think when you elevate just rationality in one sense, you end up leading to a devaluing of human beings, and so and you don't see each human being as being somewhat authentic in their own right. So the next one, so therefore, I mean, it seems as if for me that in order for people to try to reconcile authenticity and rationality, it's either they have to appeal to some sort of supernatural explanation, or super sensible explanation. But without kind of a supernatural or super sensible explanation, it's difficult to reconcile the two. And even some of the super sensible explanations, we're looking at maybe Hegel with like this ambitious system of like some sort of absolute spirit where it reconciles kind of subjectivity and objectivity together. But those kind of that type of philosophical optimism is not appealing for most philosophers today. And but because when you read, I think when I read like Hegel or and so on, like it feels as if like on the surface it feels quite wild what he's trying to accomplish, but I think maybe there's like a recognition that actually it requires a very ambitious attempt to a very ambitious philosophy in order to reconcile these two. But um, and if you don't have that, then it becomes almost difficult to reconcile these two, which also leads to problems in culture and so on moving forward, and that one's going to emphasize one or the other. So so this leads us to part two. So without an understanding, so we lead to without whether our understanding of ourselves can be known and be consistent with the rational order. That is a big question for the modern world today. Can you be authentic and rational together at the same time in the modern world? So this leads us to part two. So the importance of understanding narratives as a means of understanding oneself and the role. So what is the role of imagination? Each person sees their life as following a specific pattern, and from this pattern creates a story about themselves and their existence. So we encounter the world, we engage with the world around us, and from this we end up trying to create certain patterns, and also we create certain patterns about our life, and from those patterns we end up developing a story about maybe our position in the world in which we live in, and from that we try to imagine purpose as well within that. To do this, people use their imagination to combine to envision a greater perspective of their life. And or another word could be used is a social imaginary, which has been coined by the term. The term is coined by Charles Taylor. And what we mean by social imaginary is Taylor means the way in which people imagine their social existence, including the deeper normative notions and images that underline their expectations about themselves and their social context. So there are notions and images, i.e., let's say identity, truth, goodness, beauty. So how people see the world, what do people see themselves as? What is their view of truth, goodness, and beauty about one's life that create expectations? So something about a possibility in the future, about what they want to see in themselves and their and their social context. So through the imagination and through their experience and their social existence in the world, they use their imagination in light of their identity and their view of truth, goodness, and beauty. That what they do with that imagination is that they create expectations, and in what expectations or possibilities that they want to see in themselves and also in their social context. So, if someone builds in a social imaginary um, of believing themselves to be, um, a, believing that maybe that their gender in which they were assigned at birth, as we use in the modern thing, is maybe not their gender, for instance, then they could use their imagination in order to create a different perception of themselves, of truth, of goodness and beauty, in order to, and then from that imagination, they create an expectation about what they want to see. So they do surgery, and then they also want to be in a social context in which they validate that particular surgery as well. So this is where you see that social imaginary played out in our own, sometimes, context today. And people view their context through a narrative story. And this is also true, even like I mentioned Hegel before, but Hegel is not a Christian in any orthodox sense of the term. So just to keep that in mind. But I think Hegel has an interesting perspective on the value of the narrative structure and so on. And so even philosophers like Hegel and see art forms like theatre, so like narrative story theatre, as being the best art form because of its narrative structure. So the reason why is because it makes you appreciate the mundane things. So for instance, when you watch a movie and you see a character walk down the street, for instance, the director is purposely putting that particular scene in the movie because that particular scene is important in trying to understand the grand story at the grand narrative or conclusion at the end of the story. So for the viewer, what that should represent to us is that when we see a character walking down the street in the movie, we shouldn't treat that as somehow irrelevant, but we should see it as actually, this is actually something important, and that should be reflective in our own life. That in our own life, when we see ourselves walking down the street, or when we see ourselves in a particular point in time, we shouldn't just see it as irrelevant, but we should, if we see ourselves as part of a growing narrative that's being placed in time and history, we should see that actually even every single day when we walk to the station is still contributing to a greater purpose and narrative that you may see yourselves in that particular time and space. So that's why sometimes movies give this and make you appreciate the mundane things, as like, say, walking to the train station or working in a job that you don't like. So you may see these events in your life as being somehow mundane or forgetful, but actually they're very much part of what makes you you in the end of the day. So, but I bring this point up because it's suggesting that to think in this term, I think, makes sense, because when we tell a part of our life, we tend to tell it as part of a story, as a narrative, and that we have a beginning and end, and we tend to think in terms of purpose. But all that is used by the imagination and how we connect these different mundane events and the big events together, we end up creating a story about ourselves in the process. So, what does it mean to be human then? Well, to be human is to ask questions about who we are, why we are here, what is life about? And most often, we answer those questions using stories. And sometimes we go further, telling grand stories just about everything, which weave together all other individual stories that we tell. But if we see ourselves in a grand story, which story do we understand ourselves to be playing? So, if we're constantly telling stories about ourselves, and these stories somehow make sense about who we think we are, what is true, what is good, what is beautiful in the world, and so on, and what our purpose is in it, how do we imagine that story to be playing out? How do we connect the dots together? And then we have to ask ourselves, is this story coherent with reality itself, or does it contradict it? And to create a story, like I said before, we need the imagination in order to create, to use our past and present experiences in order to reconcile that, in order to envision future possibilities, a way the world could be for myself and the world around me. And that's how we end up building these grand narratives about ourselves, and how culture is eventually kind of shaped by that. So, what is the cognitive faculty of imagination? Well, imagination helps us to think about a way the world could be. It's the realm of possibility. So, whereas beliefs, in one sense, can be subjected to a particular form of maybe like evidence and so on. It can in the moment impose upon you a particular normative ethic in which, because I hold these beliefs, therefore I must act it out. Imagination doesn't necessarily have that normative notion to it like belief does. Imagination is written in the realm of possibility. So, for instance, if I imagine like the tree right in front of me to become a monster in one sense, I mean, like it's not as if I believe that, but I can imagine it, and I'm trying to think of the realm of the way the world could be, in one sense. So it works differently than, I think, beliefs, but imagination does play a role in how we envision the world could be, and it's also part of how we try to make sense of the world around us. So just to use a quick example, you got the light bulb and the switch example, where I see the switch on the wall and I see the light bulb in front of me, and I hit the switch and the light goes off. I hit the switch again, the light goes on, and I could, if I had no idea of like circuits and so on and how the two are connected, I could use my imagination to be like, well, I do think I see these two events. I see myself switch. I see myself switch I hit the switch on the wall, but then I notice that when I hit the switch on the wall, it affects the light, and then I can use my imagination to bring a particular object that may not be in my vision into the surface. So, for instance, like a circuit cable, I don't see the circuit connect to the light bulb, but I'm seeing it as that there must be some form of connection between the two. There must be a possibility of thinking that there is some form of connection between the two. Once I know and I realize actually there is something connecting between the two, a circuit between the two, now I form a belief with that, and then now I'm obligated in one sense. Now I know the evidence as well, and I end up forming beliefs from that. But it all started with the realm of imagination and so on, and now if you apply that principle to your whole life, now you have many different events that come at you, and you have different causations and so on. Sometimes you have an event here, and you know that this event is connected to another event over here, but you don't know how it works. So you use your imagination to create a possible account of why these two work. But then you find out, okay, you find out how these two are connected. But more importantly, I think imagination, also creates future expectations. So yes, it might help you find a link between two possible events, but more importantly, from those two possible events, it helps you think about, okay, what are future possibilities from that event that can look like going forward? And I think it has, so for instance, the imagination so to use the quotation here, and the imagination is our cognitive route to knowledge of possibility, the faculty that brings possible worlds. Possible worlds is a philosophical term of the ways the worlds could be within our mental scope. Thus, we are not mere recorders of actual fact, but capable of contemplating alternatives. This capacity is what makes possible fiction, science, morality, politics, philosophy, and civilization itself. I think what's interesting about this quote is that it says how we're not just like a computer that just takes in information about events and we're just, all we're doing is just making sense of particular just two events that happen within time. We're actually trying to envision from the events in which we take from us a future of way the world is going to be sometime in the future, and how I fit into that vision, and how the world fits into that vision, And and you notice immediately you end up creating a story with the imagination because of the realm of possibility. Now, I felt like with talking about the imagination, it's probably helpful to bring up another song, a famous song, John Legend's Imagine. Famous song. But notice the story in which he's trying to convey here. He's using his imagination. He wants the listener to use their imagination about a particular possibility that he envisions would be best for the world. And then he creates a story from it. So look at the lyrics. Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us. Above us, only sky. So, and then the chorus 1. Imagine all the people living for today. Verse 2. Nothing to kill or die for. No religion too. Chorus 2. Imagine all the people living in peace. Chorus 3. You may say I'm a dreamer. And what's interesting is, well, imagination, dreams, and dreaming sometimes used, sometimes together. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope, there you go, possibility. I hope someday you'll join us and the world will live as one. Now, as you know, I didn't quote the whole song, but I just kind of took little sound bites from the song. But what's interesting about the song is how I'm going to talk more about the narrative structure and the story in which he creates later on. But I think it's interesting he appeals to the imagination. And I think Pascal in his Pensées book speaks about imagination, how imagination decides everything. It creates beauty, justice, and happiness, which is the world's supreme good. So it's through the imagination in which we see a possibility in the future. It's able to harmonize certain events, which creates a story, which creates a deeper affection for, or an aesthetic, beautiful experience when you are able to connect certain events together. It also envisions a sense of justice in society, because we saw the previous quote how it creates civilization as well, like imagination, because you're looking in the realm of possibility. You can't just perceive the world in one sense and look at the facts of the world. You have to envision, okay, from these facts we need to imagine, okay, what does it mean for a society to be just? We have to appeal to our imagination. And also happiness. What is the good life? Well, how do I use my imagination in order to create a world in myself, a possible world in which the way I view myself today can be happy in the world around me? And we use the imagination. So Lennon in the song wants us to imagine the world he thinks will bring beauty, justice, and happiness. He wants us to imagine. He wants to say, and he's trying to pitch that to his reader. And it's obviously, and we're going to talk more about that later on. So Lennon can't, but in one sense, so Lennon can make sense of the world around him without appealing to his imagination about the past and future possibilities. So so imagination plays a big role in constructing a story from the past, but then also about future possibilities. But then the question is, what does it mean to have a godly imagination about reality? What does it mean to have a biblical imagination about reality? Because we recognize that imagination plays a massive role in our understanding about the world around us and how we see ourselves and the story we construct. Pascal saw, before I read the quote, we see immediately how imagination plays a massive role in our ability, how we see ourselves and the world around us. And, Pascal also saw imagination greater than reason. He says how reason never wholly overcomes imagination. Imagination has a way. So, for instance, he gives an example of like a philosopher looking down the precipice and looking down the hill, and that even though he may think that he is safe, and that all reason would tell him that he's safe, but the problem that ends up happening is that your imagination can sometimes tell you otherwise, and then you end up believing your imagination over the actual facts in the present moment. So we see this sometimes in maybe in like everyday life, where sometimes if someone takes a plane journey across the Atlantic, and the airlines, and we hear all the time that the safest form of travel is flights and airlines. Like, you're more likely to get into an accident in a car crash than you are in taking a plane. We hear that, but that doesn't stop people from being more fearful of taking plane by taking the plane than they are taking the car, because their imagination knows that, well, even though statistically it is safer to take the plane than it is the car, but because of how high I am in the sky, and that if there were to be a malfunction, a possible world in which the plane was actually not altogether safe, then I have a 100% chance, or almost 99.99% chance of dying if the plane were to malfunction. Whereas in the car, I probably have maybe more of a chance of survival if the car malfunctioned. But it's interesting how that, even though the statistics would say that to take the plane travel is actually, you're probably more likely to be safer, it still doesn't stop people from imagining that actually maybe something could bad happen, and so on and so forth. But so in that sense, I think that's what Pascal means when he says imagination is greater than reason, that we can always imagine our way out of a situation, even though reason would say, which is the organ for truth, would say, actually, this is actually not the case, and actually you can feel comfortable and safe in this scenario. So Pascal further would say, who makes us respect and revere persons, works, laws, and the great? Who but the faculty of imagination? All riches of earth are inadequate without its approval. So it's only through the role of imagination. It's not through just knowing truth, but it's also knowing truth in light of one's imagination that we can actually grow to have a great appreciation of the great works, laws, and persons in the past. And Pascal has another statement on this where he says, the heart has its reasons of which reason knows nothing. Now that may sound like a convoluted statement, but what it's referring to, and here's the quotation just to kind of explain it a bit more. Here, reason is used in a double sense. The reasons of the heart, or the heart has its reasons, are the structures of aesthetic and communal experience. So that has to do, so the reasons, the heart has its reasons. The reasoning of the heart is to deal with beauty and love. So that is to do with the role of imagination. So that type of reasoning is over here where imagination is in the realm of love, beauty, and so on. Whereas technical reason, so he said the reason which cannot comprehend them is technical reason. So the reason in which that we use for the part of our mind in which we use to generate love and beauty, we use it for the role of imagination. But the part of the mind we use just to know hardcore facts, technical reason, is the one that is anchored towards truth. So here we see a difference between reason and imagination. The former, reason, is for truth, and the latter for meaning, beauty, and love. So we see a difference between the two. But this may create a tension. Does this definition create an unnecessary tension between reason and imagination? So C.S. Lewis's famous assertion that while reason is the natural organ for truth, imagination is the organ for meaning. So you got the technical reason, or reason, which is the natural organ for truth, but then the use of imagination is the organ for meaning. So if this distinction is true, does this not separate truth and meaning? Does Christianity concern itself with truth? Does not Christianity concern itself with truth as much as meaning? So for instance, like, are we, as Christians, are we not concerned with the facts and the reality of Christ dying and rising again? It's not as, like, are we concerned about this? And we will say yes. So, but even though that is a fact in reality, but that reality and that fact is positioned in a particular time of history, in a particular narrative that makes sense of that truth in that particular context. So for instance, for a truth to be meaningful for a truth to make sense in a particular context. It has to be placed in a particular narrative or story or a particular purpose in mind in order for that truth to actually make sense. Without the overarching grand narrative of the world, truth itself makes no sense. Truth and meaning have to be coincide together. So when I speak about the gospel narrative and that the gospel imagination about the world is more coherent, I'm not saying that over against truth about the facts of reality. All I am saying is that the two and two coincide together. The imagination and the story and the narrative of the gospel, it coincides with the truth and the facts of the reality. They both go together. So the gospel concerns itself with both because both reason and imagination, because we are human beings who desire truth but also meaning. Truth has to be contextualized within a grander narrative, or else it becomes of no concern. So if a truth, for instance, and this is sometimes the problem maybe for me, like when it comes to like education nowadays, is where we give people just facts about the world, but we're not really giving them a perspective that actually these facts can actually help you understand your place within this world and this grander narrative. And so once you sever truth from purpose and meaning, then you end up giving kids information that they don't see any purpose in having anyway. Like, why do I need to know? Why knowing this particular topic is going to help me for this? And so what we've done is that we've severed truth from meaning, and now the desire for truth isn't really there because it doesn't come across as being meaningful once it's to know. Therefore, biblical truth is understood and communicated through a narrative story. And this is important, and I love this quotation here where it says, "The Bible is rich in narratives, each of which can be thought of as a thread that is woven into a grand and biblical meta-narrative, a story about creation, the fall, the calling of Israel, the death and resurrection of Jesus. There is a sense in which to be Christian is to see the grand story as defining and authoritative, challenging the rival stories of human origin, nature, and destiny offered by our world. Our own stories are given meaning and value by being interpreted by and located within this greater story." So, and to another quotation, Michael Horton, "The prophets and apostles were fully conscious of the fact that they were interpreting reality within the framework of a particular narrative of creation, fall, redemption, consummation, as told to a particular people for the benefit of the world. The biblical faith claims that its story is the one that God is telling, which relativizes and judges the other stories about God, us, and the world." So it's interesting from that we see that the gospel has a narrative of its own, and it's an overarching narrative that when God asserts a truth, He's asserting a truth within Him acting within creation, within time, within a story, within the grand narrative. That actually the biblical account that we have to the culture, the biblical account and story we have a great story to tell people about this vision of reality, which we will get into more in depth later. And that to encourage that, sometimes our apologetic method is to say, well, everyone has a particular story that tries to accommodate themselves, to accommodate truth and their imagination within their reality. But what we are saying is that God in the biblical accounts is actually presenting an account that is actually consistent not only with who we are and our understanding of ourselves, but also reality itself. Just more like a historical fact. Dryness has a particular quotation about how this kind of view of history started developing within the Reformation, where it says the Reformation introduced a new metaphysic and a new view of time and history. History is continuing development of how God is interacting in creation and His people. So it's not as if the Bible ends in Revelation, but actually God's continuing to interact with creation and his people. One does not go back in time to live out the cross, but is to live the cross before the theatre of God. And that's a famous quotation from Calvin as far as the theatre of God. So in one sense that it's about how do we live out that God is working in his people today, and that we're called to live out the cross today before our lives, and that becomes our identity. That is the truth. That is what it means to live the good life. That is what is most beautiful in one sense, and we'll go through those things later. But all this to suggest that the world, in one sense, and how people have described it before, is a glorious theater. That there is a story that God is working out in creation that starts from the beginning of creation to the fall, to our redemption, and finally consummation with God. That we are joined with God and God restores all things. There's a beautiful story with that and narrative that isn't just purely imagination, but is rooted in also in reason and in truth as well. So now this leads us to part 3 with this narrative structure with the fall, with creation, the fall, redemption, and consummation. So how are modern narratives about reality still followed a religious narrative structure to explain their own story? Well, imagination creates a story through a narrative of creation, fall, redemption, and consummation. Then reason. So after when you kind of have this kind of overarching perspective about the world and about the future of things and one's place within that world, then reason critiques this narrative, which the imagination has created, and asks if it is true and has the possibility of being true. So once you create this world of possibility, and the way you feel like the world should be, and yourself, and so on, and your particular part in this story, then we ask reason, and then we ask like reason, or the organ for truth in one sense, to critique and ask ourselves like, okay, well, in light of the biblical scriptures, and the scripture narrative, which narrative can accommodate better for the world around us? And imagination and reason should work together, but often one triumphs over the other. And so we saw the Pascal analogy where like all the facts told you that that plane travel is more safer than say taking a car, and somehow the imagination can take over and lead to a form of irrationality over reason. But then sometimes reason can also limit the imagination, where we feel like, like I told the example of the education system, where if we just give people just facts about reality, therefore we can make them into upstanding moral people, when actually no, you need the imagination. You need to make them know that they're a part of a greater story, that how they're acting is actually that truth that they know that is meant to benefit them is part of also a greater narrative story that they're playing out. So if it is reason that triumphs, you have the problem of rationality over authenticity, as we mentioned before. If it's imagination, then you have the problem of authenticity over rationality, as we see as before, and where one values their own judgment over the world than the way the world actually is. And that's what I mean by that their standard of judgment about the world is seen to be more true than the way the world actually is. So you need to work them both. So back to our example with John Lennon's Imagine. So we're going to use that as an example of how this kind of narrative structure, this kind of religious narrative structure, is also found, I think, in John Lennon's Imagine. So worldviews or perspectives are caused by narratives that are shaped around a theme that gives an account of creation, fall, redemption, consummation. So how does John Lennon's Imagine, which is against religious belief and promotes a type of atheistic secular humanism, how does that work? Well, so what is John Lennon's creation account? Well, from creation, all the world were living as one and in unity. He recites that line over and over again, and because because ultimately what people are viewing is that humanity fell from somewhere. Like, because if there was no unity or living in one before, and so on and so forth, and I would say that it's similar to probably Rousseau in one way or another, that this would be more of like a hypothetical scenario that there probably maybe was a time before religion and a type of capitalism and so on, that hypothetically that the world was living as one in those times. So I would say that his creation account is catering towards a is basically the conclusion of his consummation account. So as we'll go into, so the world was living as one and in unity. The fall. So what is the problem that Lenin sees in the world today? He says, well, due to beliefs about the future, God, faith, heaven, hell, religion, and capitalism have caused people to forget the present needs and create a society of envy and jealousy. So there's the problem in society. Okay, so how do we resolve this problem in society? We need to focus upon ourselves in the present and realize that religion and capitalism doesn't solve the problem, but to see secular humanism and socialism as the solution. So, and that's quite a common critique of, particularly in those in the more Marxist tradition and socialist tradition. They would have that religion ends up, what religion is to that those who are in the most powerful use religion in order to make their suffering legitimized. So therefore the rich stay richer and the poor stay poorer, type of scenario. But then how do you overcome this? Consummation. Once we realize this and put secular humanism to practice, the world would live as one in truth, goodness, and all things would be beautiful. So that's kind of the world, that there are particular structures in society and ways of thought and imaginations that probably Lenin would probably use, imaginations about the world that are preventing us from living as one, and that maybe if we remove those man-made things, if we remove them, we can go back to the way the world probably was before these things and should be in the future. So, but with this, notice the narrative. There's a story in which appeals to the imagination that it is possible to live as one when we remove structures of our society that prevent us from living as one. And we see, and this song is so famous that people use it all the time, and they use this song as a means of saying, oh, here's a possibility, here's a story in which we can see ourselves, living and walking out and fighting for and so on. But you notice that within this particular worldview and perspective, like, there is a sense of religious character to it, creation, fall, redemption, consummation, that I think can't be avoided because we are created in the image of God. So you can evaluate a worldview or a story people have created about reality through this structure: creation, fall, redemption, consummation. So what is the understanding of so when you're like approaching someone and you're asking, okay, what is their perspective on the world? Well, a way to understand their perspective on the world is to maybe ask questions about, okay, what is their understanding of the beginning of their existence? What is their understanding of creation? Because whatever is your first cause of your existence is going to be also their final cause. Like, what is their purpose in life? So how human beings started and existed is going to be a big question, and how they understand that is going to impact how they view themselves and their story in which they're creating. Next one, people with a moral conscience would assert that actually people with a moral conscience would say that that the world is actually not is imperfect, and the question you have to ask, okay, what made it imperfect? Like, what are some of the structures that you believe that were put in place that made it imperfect? Now, what's interesting about this is that most people would tend to point outwards for the problems in society. They tend to say it tends to be this, and this, but they don't recognize actually the sin within, that actually human beings are fallen together, and that there's a lack of recognition of the fallenness of one's own person before God, and I think that's a big problem. So we end up pointing outward for the problem, and therefore that ends up impacting their solution to the problem. So they're not saying, okay, how do we as humanity in our fallen state come back to an understanding that we need to live before God and we are fallen. Actually, we're going to say, well, our redemption is revolution, that we are going to overthrow particular authoritarian structures. We're going to overthrow those things. And it's not to say that Christians we should stand up against injustice, but the solution to the fallenness of the world and is not just going to be resolved by is not going to be resolved by human by removing one particular structure, because when you move one particular structure, then another structure comes in place, and then with human beings, because they're imperfect, they're going to sin and they'll creep back in injustice and so on. So the problem is sometimes a human nature in one sense, but from the world's perspective, it's always a authoritarian some structure. And then once you destroy that structural revolution or whatever perspective they have, then they're going to come to a conclusion and say, okay, well, once that particular thing is destroyed, what do you think is the possible outcome of that? What do you think is going to what does it look like for the human race looking afterwards? But I bring up these questions because they follow a religious structure, and I think it follows a religious structure because people it has like it kind of is given a religious account of their perspective of the world, that there's a sense in which human beings need to be played part. Human beings have a part in the story, or human beings need a sense of justice in one sense, or there needs to be good to be implemented in the world. And I feel like these are religious notions without realizing it, and now people frame their stories are actually very religious. And I think part of that is, Calvin in his Institutes speaks about a sensus divinitatis, a sense of deity that people have, a moral intuition, a sense in which people even if God in society was not the prominent belief, it wasn't axiomatic, as Charles Taylor would say, there's still a moral conscience, still a desire for justice in society, that God has placed that. But the problem is that those desires have been corrupted by sin, and we end up directing and trying to find other means in order to find that, in order to find a solution to that problem, instead of actually looking to Christ. So we have built in the religious notions to think about the world in this way, a moral intuition to want to know why we are here, what is wrong with the world, and how true equity and justice be shown in the world, and hope for a better world to live in. I think that's a very religious notion to live in, and because the type of secular humanism where we're just cosmic accidents doesn't really cater to that type of phenomenon. Like, why do we ask questions? Why does our conscience tend to elevate the absence of something over against what is actually there? And I think that's because we have the imagination, or God has given us an imagination in order to find ourselves in a world, to understand ourselves in a world that He has created for us to live in, and that imagination needs to be a godly imagination overall. And so what is our apologetic approach? Well, people have labeled this the Augustinian way, which is, one, what is the prevailing narrative that is shaping our culture? So what is the story that, in general, about the main, and you can know that through social media, music, art, and so on. Those are quite commonplaces. What are some of the narratives and stories and ideas that people see about themselves in our culture, and that is shaping the social imaginary, how they think about themselves in the world? Then once you notice a particular narrative that you see, then you ask, okay, then you do an internal critique of this narrative and why it is incomplete and incoherent. So once you kind of notice a narrative, then you want to find out, okay, well, what is it about this narrative that doesn't deliver on its promises? So what is it about that's incoherent? 2A, then present the gospel narrative. or a vision of reality, and why it is the only vision that presents a coherent perspective of creation, fall, redemption, consummation. And after this, be able to point out some of the positive aspects, if any, of each worldview and say how that positive aspect can only find its fulfillment in the gospel message. So what is the prevailing narrative? Do an internal critique. So remember, we look at the creation, fall, redemption, consummation structure, how they use imagination, what is their understanding of the self, and so on. And then you bring in the gospel narrative, how it has the ability to reconcile the appearance of reality around us, and also how the gospel narrative is consistent with our human nature, who God is, and that God is interacting with time, and the biblical testimony that continues until this day, and that God is still working, and that God is going to restore all things, and there's a hope in that, and that we have, that's true. And then also when we look at the positive aspects, like sometimes you talk to people and that they say something that is actually true, but that it could be like maybe maybe injustice in society, and you may say, well, that is true that there is injustice, but your solution to that problem is actually cannot be found in just doing X, Y, and Z, but it's actually found in the gospel message through Christ and so on. And that once you build a foundation of the gospel message in Christ, then actually we can know that, one, as Christians, we're meant to fight against injustice or stand up against injustice. But we also really need to recognize that the moral problem is not going to be resolved when we take down structures, but it's actually going to be found when we come back to Christ and recognize who we are, that we are sinful beings in need of redemption through Christ, and we need to be reconciled with our Creator. So from the stories we create or adopt about the world and ourselves through reason. From the stories we create and adopt about the world and ourselves through reason and imagination, a person comes to an understanding of what they think truth, good, and beautiful are. If you believe that there is no God, believe there is no God or an act of divine creation / will, you might conclude that all truth is relative. If there is no standard of goodness or virtue, you might conclude that goodness is shaped by the powerful in society. If you think aesthetic experiences is completely subjective, then beauty can be understood strictly as a utility for one's own gain and cannot contribute to knowledge beyond that experience. So over the next few weeks, we will look over each of these, truth, goodness, and beauty, and why the gospel harmonizes them to create a coherent vision for reality. So the questions I have for the Q&A afterwards is, have you encountered any ideas you think fit the narrative of creation, fall, redemption, consummation structure? 2, when someone asks you, who are you? What do you say? And 3, have you considered if your imagination is linked to your understanding of who God is and the world around you? Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you guys next week.